I mean, but yeah, I mean, we could also just literally start from now.
Okay,
Should we start from
let's
now?
do it.
Okay, so we're starting from now. Um, Man. But this is interesting because this feels weird because it's so different from our normal format.
Yeah,
But
a very formulaic way of doing it in the beginning. Let's see how it goes.
yeah, exactly. Anyway, the first thing that I wanted to talk about was light linking, obviously. So this is something that you and I have talked about for a long time, being the golden standard of how to light and how to render stuff in pretty much every software except Blender, right? And we've always met a lot of resistance from, I'm not going to say everyone that uses Blender, but I think the general consensus has been that there's been a lot of resistance to something like light linking. Like, why would you need light linking? I think the most common example, if I were to like paraphrase every comment that I've had about it into one, it's, well, if you can't do it in the real world, why would you need to do that in Blender? Right? Which is such an obscure one because like everything we do in Blender, I mean, you're doing things inherently in CG. You're trying to improve on realism. I mean, either you're trying to match realism, but even when you're trying to match realism, you're still trying to do things in camera that you can't do in camera. And so light linking for me has always been this natural thing that it was just missing. Like we just talked about right before going live with it, that product shots was such a big thing that were hard to do when you don't have light linking, because everything gets affected by everything if you aren't able to light link. And sure, that's not realistic. That's not how you would do product shots in the real world. But in CG, we're able to direct lights and shadows and reflections in such a way that it comes out perfect every time.
Yeah.
And so not having light linking for me has been this whole like, oh man, I've constantly been battling it and coming up with hacks and workarounds just to make it look like I've been able to light link.
Yeah, I guess just to explain kind of what light linking is, because there have been a lot of people who were just asking about that constantly. We were talking about that. It just means that one light can affect one object and one object only. You can include and exclude light or objects from lights. This means you have a lot of control. But I think kind of real photo shoots and movie sets and such, they have kind of been using light linking anyway, like in physical sets. They're just spending a lot of time to make weird gobos and such to block out light so that it would only hit in a certain spot. I think they did this for Blade Runner as well. This might not be true. I'm pretty sure it is for Blade Runner to like light up their eyes, where they have like highly focused lights just going into their eyes just to give that weird ethereal sci-fi effect for that. So now instead of doing that in CG, you can just select an object and say only affect this light. So this is a massive one. There aren't, in every single new version of a software, there aren't that many things that allows you to do things you couldn't do before. Oftentimes, new features are things that allows you to do the same thing but faster, or it might implement some kind of library or something. AGX is a good example of that. You could do it before, but now it's just natively built in. But light linking allows you to do stuff that you couldn't actually do before. If we were just, Morten was saying, we're just talking about this. If I were to do product shots for Blender, I would need to actually use something like V-Ray or something else, like an actual third-party engine, because light linking is such an important one. Like, what if you just need one object to be a lot brighter, or you just need reflections in a certain spot? Sure, you could comp it out, but that just gets incredibly complicated. You can just click like 3 buttons and now you can just artistically direct this. I worked on freelance gigs before where every single object was lit with a bespoke light, just because that was what the director of the shot wanted. And if I couldn't do that, he would be like, yeah, but why can't you do that? My other 3D artists can do that. This was using Modo back in the day, and this was just when light linking was like made properly available in Modo. Before that, I wouldn't have been able to do that job in Modo. I would have to use Maya or something else. So, big one, this one.
Yeah, it was such a like I can't remember a time, at least after I got interested in lighting and rendering, when I was using Maya, for example, where I wasn't able to do it.
Yeah.
Right. So when we started getting into Blender, and I started doing more lighting and rendering in Blender, it came as such a surprise to me that it just wasn't in the software. And so my approach to light linking in Blender up until this point has been to create like these small shadow catchers. So I would use really small lights. Oftentimes I would actually use spotlights, because spotlights were already a directed light. You know, it has like a fixed cone and it'll only send out rays right where the cone is. So you could use that to maybe create some kind of rim on the shoulders, and then have like a shadow catcher next to the face or whatever, because you didn't want it to bleed over on the face. Or maybe there was pieces of armor on your character that you didn't want the light to hit. So it was like some of my characters, if you look at them in the viewport, had like this entire silhouette of just shadow catchers everywhere in order to block out any unwanted light.
It was a real pain in the ass, because without that, it might work. You're basically lighting for not just a specific shot, but a highly specific angle. So if you were to change the angle slightly of the camera, you have to basically redo it, because now the shadow catcher and thing just doesn't work. You have to just build some crazy setup. Now you just click the buttons. So massive change. Big fan. I haven't used it too much, but you've been playing around that for the lighting scene, right? Like how stable is it currently in the released version?
It's it's stable as long as you don't have to create light linking. Then it's stable.
Oh, only that thing. So only using it
when you're. So the initial creation, I don't know if it's because of I'm working in heavy scenes or what it is, but I experienced this bug quite a lot, and I promised people that I would report it. I just haven't had time. I will do it though. I will do it
for real.
When I create, so the way that light linking works in Blender is you do it based on collections, right? So you use a collection and you link or unlink that. And whenever you drag the collection to be light linked, that's when it crashes for me. I'm sure it's an easy fix. It just has to be done. Other than that, it works flawlessly. Like linking, unlinking, once everything is created in the collections, it's super easy. One thing that I really like as well, that I didn't expect from this feature, was that they do shadow linking as well. So that you can have light, but they don't necessarily cast any shadows as well. In a way, it's kind of the same thing with light linking, depending on how you structure your collections. But it's just another way to, you just have more customizability with your light linking. So I do really like that. And then when you combine that with lights not in their light settings not having to show up in reflections, or don't cast any reflection, or don't show up in reflections and stuff, then it becomes really powerful, because then you can really start to direct. Maybe you have a light that only shows up in reflections but doesn't necessarily cast shadows, and you can really start to mix and match. So I think Blender's heading in a good direction now. I mean, I don't really know from a lighting perspective what more I really need there. Like light linking was like the last big hurdle for me.
One thing that I would think would be really useful for that is the current implementation of HDRIs. I think is hella clunky, because unless you use a node wrangler and do like the Control T and you just set up the material there, or the nodes, like you don't really know how to do it. Like you would actually have to Google how to set up an HDRI, and I when you use a node wrangler, I know how to do that, but I would actually have a bit of a hard time just setting up an HDRI myself without the node wrangler at the moment. Well, in a lot of other software, you just make a like in Maya and Arnold, you just make basically just a sky dome light, and you just input a texture into that. So that's incredibly intuitive, but that's like, it wouldn't really change the output of it. Like, it would still be the same thing. It's the same thing we're talking about here with AGX. It's a new thing technically, but you can still get the same result. It would just be making it a lot more user-friendly. And I mean, maybe that would be a good way to do it, just an environmental light or some kind of dome light, and plug in a texture to that. It's cool that you have the freedom to set up an environment the way you do now. It's just a little weird. There are a lot of these things in Blender. I find that things that is pretty simple things in other software, I have to Google how to do, and I might have to have like just a screenshot, something setting that up. I remember in the beginning, before I knew about the node wrangler, I would just do like a PureRef board with like these kind of little tricks how to do specific setups and such. So I find that there'd be a lot of these kind of weird I wouldn't even sure if they were going to call them paper cuts, just like unrefined UX in it. But that would definitely be one thing for lighting that would be a big help for me. But it's pretty refined now, to be honest, as a software in terms of lighting and rendering.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we experience. So we both used 3ds Max before, and then we used Maya. You obviously used Modo for a while, and I touched it like once, so I can't really speak to that. But I also used 3D Code in the past, and well, 3D Code is a little weird, I will admit. But the Maya and Max are fairly comparable, I think. But Blender was always for you and I like you could do the same thing, but in a Blender way.
Very.
Right. So it was always like it almost felt kind of contrarian that Blender had to do it. You could do the same thing, but you would have to do it differently compared to not. I wouldn't call it a standard, but maybe other softwares figure out a simple way to do
a
things.
Logical way, if you will.
Yeah, and I was kind of afraid that was going to be the same thing with light linking, but I'm actually surprised that it's just a straight up good implementation. Not that the other things aren't good implementations in Blender. It's just a lot of the time I feel like we have to figure out, like you say, you actually have to Google it. It doesn't come as naturally. Kind of like when you're using ZBrush.
Yeah.
Right? Nothing is natural in ZBrush. You literally have to Google everything. Whereas if you open up Mudbox, you would be able to sculpt pretty much without having opened the software before.
Like I think for like in terms of UX there, based on what I've been mentioning so far, I think somebody could pretty accurately or pretty quickly open up Maya without having really used Maya before and set up an HDRI. But I don't think you'll be able to do that with Blender at the moment. I think in order to set up an HDRI in Blender, and I think you really have to know how to do that. Somebody has to show you the method for that because it's just so specific. So there are just a lot of those weird ones there, for instance.
Yeah, it's a welcome change, and at least I think they've done a good job with the implementation. Yeah. I need to report that bug. I'm sure I'm not the only. Now that it's officially released, I'm not the only one who is experiencing that. But I mean, there must be something in the scenes that I'm working with that triggers it, because it's literally the first step in creating light linked collections that fails for me 90% of the time. So I'm sure it's like maybe it's highly specific to my scene setup or something. They would have caught it in bug testing otherwise.
Yeah.
It would be crazy if that had gone past. They're like, yeah, we don't see any problems with that. Like for me, I literally have to close Blender, reopen it, create the light linked collection within 10 or 15 seconds of my scene being open, almost like I don't have enough resources to create it or something. Otherwise it crashes. Don't know why that's the case.
Speaking of your scene, what is the scene you're working on?
It's the lighting scenes, the new lighting scenes. I guess technically it's version 3.0, but I think going forward we're just going to be calling it the Flip Normals lighting scenes. And they're coming out for Blender to begin with, and then we're porting that to
Arnold.
Is it Viri? Arnold.
Yeah, Arnold.
Yeah, it's Arnold.
Only those two. The old ones used to be for Viri, for Max, or Modo, for everything we can get our hands on, and we're not doing that anymore.
It was just too much to maintain.
Yeah.
And now with I was not sure about, because we had the lighting scenes before for Blender. Someone converted them for us, and then we sort of started reselling that. But it still wasn't. It was a good product, but it wasn't the best version of the lighting scenes. Like it was like an inferior version of the lighting scenes because you couldn't light link.
Yep.
You would have had to create a bunch of shadow casters there as well, which is almost impossible when you're doing it for a general purpose lighting scene, because shadow catchers are good when you're doing one specific asset or character. And so with that version, you would have a lot of light bleed on the floor, where you could see, okay, here's an area light. It's very clear. So sometimes in your renders, you would just like have this harsh line behind your character or behind your assets. We're fully getting rid of that now because of light linking. And then obviously it's getting upgraded because of AGX as well. So we're able to get a lot more like deeper and richer colors into the renders compared to what we were before with Filmic.
Yeah, should we talk about AGX for a second?
Sure.
For me, AGX is one of the really cool features for that. about a year ago, we released a course called Character Portrait Masterclass, and that was using ZBrush, Blender, and Substance Painter for the whole thing. So that was a full Blender production. And during the rendering, when I was setting that up, I just couldn't get it look right. So I was experimenting with Filmic and just didn't look right. The colors washed out. Disable Filmic, so you just use the regular sRGB LUT, and that looks awful. Everything just looks dirty. And then somebody on Twitter very kindly sent me a link to AGX, and so it's been there for a year. But you just had to replace Filmic with AGX, so you had to go in and like basically delete Filmic and replace it with that. A little bit convoluted in the beginning, but once you had the setup, it was great. We were always hesitant to use AGX in tutorials. Like we discussed that for the lighting scene Morten is working on now, whether we should use it or not, because you want to stick to as default as possible. But once we got AGX set up, it looked so much better right away. Like the colors were so much more natural. The light fall off was just a lot more natural. It's basically like a make nice render button, but not just like nice in a sense, because that's entirely subjective. Maybe some people prefer the Filmic look, but I would say it's objectively better because it allows you to have more control, more range in your colors, better control over saturations. So I think it's just a fantastic upgrade, which takes it from honestly with Filmic, it felt a little bit like an amateur look in a sense, because you couldn't really control it. If you wanted something specific, it was hard to get. And before Filmic, it was even more difficult to do it. But now it feels like you can get a proper professional balanced look out of Blender, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I think one of the big things for me, and one of the things that AGX excels at, has to do with colored lights. And we just released a Blender 4.0 feature update where I quickly cover that as well. But the big difference there is how Filmic and AGX, they handle what's called collapsing colors. So if you have a surface like a light that's close to a surface and getting closer and closer to a surface, if it's a colored light, in Filmic, the way that it would work is that it actually sort of hue shifts the light. So it changes the color and the behavior of the light, which is not how lights react in the real world. At least that's not how humans perceive light. Right? So what AGX attempts to do is simulate better how the human eye perceives color and light. And I think that's why it works so well. So if you take some of the examples that I showed in our video, is that it's from the lighting scene as well. We have some more, let's call it exciting scenes where we're using colored lights. It's not just like your standard teal and orange kind of lighting setup, the Florence Academy lighting setup with like 3-point lights. We actually use some pretty intense colors, and you really notice it in those scenes. A good example would be if you're filming like a sunset scene or something in the real world, right? Once the sun gets to that part of the horizon and the rays scatter through the atmosphere, you tend to get like this really intense orange and red light, especially on really clear days. In scenes like that, it's really hard to preserve your depth in your footage if you were using something like Filmic, right? Because everything would just shift to orange. Whereas in our eyes and with AGX, the orange light, because when it's close to our face like that, it sort of shifts towards white and not orange. So you get more depth by not just, it's almost like with Filmic, you have like an overlay of color. If it's an orange light, you just have orange everywhere. But closer to a surface, it would actually change. Instead of being orange, it's more white because the light is more intense. I hope that explanation makes sense, but that's sort of the difference there.
Yeah, the main point for me is just that it's not even do you prefer the look or not. It's just a more natural and a much more balanced image. So it's also kind of an easy win because it's not a different color space like Aces. It's a lot on top of it. So it's much easier to work with. You don't really have to change your textures and such. You might have to, I don't sure how they're actually implemented this in 4, but you just had to go in and like just change like if it was like a non-color or like a sRGB or something, but like it's not a different color space. So it's a much gentler approach to it.
Yeah, I think the big thing for me there like to sum it up real quick, is just that I get richer. My renders are richer in color because there's more variation, and I'm getting more depth in my lights,
Yeah.
from light to dark compared to Filmic. That's like the big takeaway from me in that. And then also, like, it's a massive upgrade for everyone because now everyone using Blender 4.0 will just have better renders.
I'm curious when or if ACES will be like fully integrated as well. Like that's something I haven't really worked too much with, but if you're in a full production, you'll probably want to
Yeah.
work with ACES today. That's what we worked with that at NPC years back, like 2014. That's when we probably started with ACES. So that this has been used for a very long time. It's a fairly established workflow. You have this in Painter as well now. So pretty certain that like Maya has ACES as well now, like properly built in. So I'm pretty certain that would be a pretty big upgrade as well. Like you can definitely install ACES for Blender, but that's a fairly involved thing now. You're not just going to casually just throw in some ACES in there.
Would it be the same as when we were manually setting up AGX? Like we just get the LUT and we create an environment variable,
Yeah.
or is there more involved?
I think it's similar to that, but the way when I've been playing with that, you have all, when you're setting like the non-color and all that kind of stuff in the list.
Yeah.
The list is like covering literally the whole screen to the point that you can't even see what's there. Like so you had to go in and you had to delete a crap ton of those from like a text file or something. All this is like very approximate knowledge, but basically like it's not just as simple as that. But of course, in a studio setting, who cares? You would have a pipeline TD who would just set that up for you, and you would just have to install something once in the beginning. But it's definitely not something you could just plug and play with. And we would definitely not use that for Flip Normals because we're much more mainstream in that regard, in a very real sense. If we're producing tutorials, you shouldn't need to change Blender like crazy. I always try to stick to as vanilla version of as possible. We were even reluctant to use AGX for the character portrait masterclass last year, just because you had to install like a third-party thing there. And I think that's kind of nice as well what we do for tutorials, because it means that you can just plug and play and you're not reliant on some highly esoteric plugin or something to make it work. But sometimes it would be nice to just like do one where it's customized like crazy as well. I used to do it all the time in Maya and Modo. My setup was like non-recognizable. And then we started with tutorials and I just deleted all that crap. And particularly for the Maya tutorials, I just went back to completely vanilla.
Yeah. I mean, it almost feels like it's not as big of a jump for me as back in the day when I finally embraced an actual linear workflow.
Yeah.
Like I'd been using V-Ray for years. And at that point, there were a couple articles out where people covered linear workflows, sort of how, you take your base maps and you convert them to linear. And then when you render it, you have to like work in sRGB, all that stuff. Like when I discovered that, the increase in range that I was able to get out of my images was crazy. And you didn't have that crunched up look anymore. Things are oversaturated. It's like this. It's not as extreme, but I feel like it's a similar thing that's happened to Blender now. And without even people, you don't even have to understand it. And you don't really have to change your workflow because AGX is just selected by default. You just plug things in and things just work.
When it comes to upgrades and software, like this is the kind of stuff that I'm kind of a sucker for, to be honest, where it's almost like big structural things in the software. I get less excited about individual tools being added to it. So something like can kind of, move gears here, but like geometry nodes, for instance, is something I'm very excited about. Not because I really care personally about geometry nodes. Procedural modeling isn't really my thing. But when you have like node tools and stuff like that, it's like an ecosystem. You're creating an actual ecosystem, and like relating to like AGX as well. It's just like an overall improvement over the whole thing that just elevates the whole software, elevates everyone's experience in it. Now, if you need something highly specific for as a modeling tool, you can build the modeling tool now. Like without too much knowledge, you can actually build your own modeling tool that before that would require Python. It wouldn't necessarily require like fancy Python. It might just be a few lines of some code. But the barrier of entry to knowing a few lines of Python, that's actually quite high.
Yeah.
Like both the two of us, we tried to actually learn Python back in a day. And I think we're pretty tech savvy, and I was never really able to make my own scripts there. It's just kind of difficult unless you're doing that like I wouldn't even say full time, but like unless you're doing that on a very regular basis. So something like particularly node tools for Blender 4 is very, very, very much welcome. I can't wait to see what that whole new ecosystem origin actually creates.
Yeah, I think, I mean, when it comes to programming, you also have to have some sort of passion for it, like to actually want it. I can't remember sort of. I think I've attempted to start Python a couple of times, and it's always been like, it would be neat to be able to know some Python, but it's never been more than that. You know, I've never desperately had to sit down and be like, okay, now I need to learn programming, otherwise I'll die. You know, I won't have a job if I don't know how to program. So I think motivation definitely helps there. There have been times where Python has definitely been used. It would have been useful to know, but I mean, nowadays ChatGPT helps out with a lot of those small tasks. So I don't know if that's ever in the cards for me. But aside from that, you know, now people really don't have to learn Python when it comes to Blender because now they can just use node tools, and they're going to keep evolving. You know, this is the first iteration of it. Obviously, it builds on geometry nodes because that's the basis of it. But from what I've seen, examples on Twitter, people what they're creating, it's like limitless. You know, as they start to refine the tools more and refine what sort of nodes are in there, they at the end you'll be able to do pretty much everything. I think when it comes to creating those tools and then being able to share them, create tool packs. I think it's a very exciting time with this sort of change. Like some of the cool examples that I saw was like someone made a rope generator, I think. You're selecting two points on a mesh, run the tool, and it like just creates ropes between. And then with the ability to have the operators be visible in the viewport as well, you can like change it on the fly. Obviously, it gets baked into the geometry, so it's one time, and then you've generated it. But while you're doing it, you know, if it's the rope thing, you could maybe control the number of ropes, the randomness, how much slack is in the ropes. All this stuff is something that you can expose to people, and then they'll be able to tweak themselves. And then obviously being able to share them and then tweak those tools and develop on top of those tools with even more nodes, I think is incredibly exciting.
Yeah, the reason I'm more excited about only the node tools than like the geo nodes themselves is because whenever I've been modeling something, I'm coming from VFX, right? And our background there, it's always been model something highly specific. And modeling something highly specific, it's kind of the opposite of procedural modeling. If you need to model a bottle, you don't want to model 500 bottles with slight variation. You need to model this specific one. And for that, you just need good old school polygonal modeling tools. And this aids that a lot. Like when I learned that the node tools were actually destructive, I got really excited because I thought when I saw all these cool demos that it was all like this weird procedural things, and in order to do it, you had to like keep collapsing a stack or like maybe import export or just working like that. But realizing it's literally just a series of modeling tools. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And we're just seeing the initial implementation of that now, and people have just got their hands on it. I'm very curious to see where this is going to go in, just the next few months. I think there's going to be a lot of awesome new tools, and probably a few tools that you actually can't work without, because that's always how it works. You get some weird rope tool or some kind of new extrude tool or something like that, and it just changes your workflow fundamentally. So very excited about that. It's visual programming.
An example. Sorry, you were saying.
It's visual programming.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the tools might not be as obvious as others because people coming into this without that big of understanding of geometry nodes might look at this and be like, okay, cool. So you can instance some things and apply transforms and do a bunch of stuff. But it's way deeper than that now, because now you'll be able to do, random selection on faces. You'll be able to, another cool example, this was from someone on Twitter called Passive Star, and he does a lot of this stuff with the node tools. He created, I think it was like a flatten tool, like based on your view or something. You select the faces and it flattens it. that kind of tool, you would have to script before, or maybe you would select it based on your view, and then you would sort of scale it with the scaling tool. Like you'd snap the scale gizmo or something to an angle and scale it from there. But these are the kinds of tools that people are able to create. I think an interesting one could be, as far as I know, there's like one add-on that adds edge flow to the modeling tools in Blender,
Yeah.
which is basically like if you have like a series of edges like this, and you have like sharp edges in between, you add the edge flow and it sort of smooths it out, right? So you have like this nice curvature that follows the edges that are surrounding it. That should be possible with no tools, and there's just so many possibilities now for people to create tools. They just need to get into nodes a little bit, understand the math behind some of the tools or some of the nodes, and then I think we're going to start to see an explosion of really incredible tools out there.
Yeah, and us not really knowing Python, if you give me a Python script for like the edit edge flow tool, I'm going to look at it and go like, all right, I can't really edit this. I can't really modify this to any degree. But if Morten makes if you were to give me a tool here, right, then I can just open that up and I can just change the parameters as I see fit. I don't have to understand anything about code. I love these kind of like visual programming tools. I think there is such cool additions to it. There's a lot of this in like general development as well. And instead of programming, you can just do node-based stuff. Big fan of that.
Yeah, it was sort of what happened with Unreal a couple of years ago. I say a couple, it's probably almost a decade ago now, probably. But as far as I understood, like they introduced some of the same things, like blueprints, I think they're called, and you there was a big focus on having less of a need on programmers and being able to visually program yourself, and sort of cutting down on that time between artist to programmer, and the artist being able to control more of it. I see this as the same thing. Like you gain a basic understanding, not of programming, but sort of like the syntax of node tools, and then you'll be able to create really amazing things with it.
And then if you know programming on top of that, that's just gonna elevate your game even more. But it's not like it's gonna take any programming jobs there or anything. It just means that the people who like us who would be able to make the tools, but we don't know programming, we can just make awesome stuff.
Yeah. What else is like a big thing? I mean, for me, lighting and geometry nodes definitely, or node tools is up there. Anything that stands out to
the
you?
Snapping tool looks really good. That looks really legit. I have already added that to our internal list of videos I want to do. I want to really make just a quick video on that. We can even have like maybe in a video on like quick tips from it as well. From Blender 4. One thing that this is like something that we aren't really well versed in at all because we're not riggers or animators, but bone collections, that seems to be a massive one for riggers. Again, not a rigger, don't really understand the full extent of that, but seems really, 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 really useful. There also seems to be some updates with the bendy bones as well, that the deformation is just much nicer. So it just respects the curvature a lot more, which seems absolutely massive. Same with like preserve volume as well. I had something similar.
That one's good. That one is good. Yeah.
Yeah, like we had something like that in Maya for some years, and I'm not sure if it's the same algorithm or not, but that made a huge difference with that. So it definitely seems to be some nice rigging updates. Again, not a rigger, just important to have that. But from talking to riggers and animators, that's always been one of the key things people are talking about, that Blender just can't really do too well yet. And I want to be careful with that because it can do it. Obviously, you have beautiful animations and rigs done in Blender, but when you have like production riggers and production animators talking about like actually wanting to use Blender in a production, that's been some of the things they keep talking about as just been lacking. It's one of the areas that Maya is incredibly mature. Like the animation tool or rigging tools there are really good. I mean, vanilla, I have no idea how good they are, but there's a really good ecosystem around the anim and the rig tools, and all the studios would have all that. So yeah, that's definitely a very welcome change, because we keep talking about that all the time, like is Blender industry standard or not? I mean, what does that even mean, right? We listened to the CG Cookie podcast we were on for more discussion on that, but regardless, it just means is more like, is adoption increasing or not? And there are just some barriers of entry, and the easier it is for like companies, not even like big studios. MPC is never going to switch to Blender, but just for like medium-sized companies to do rigging and animation, that's a huge thing. If this update here is sufficient for that, I have no idea. Probably not, but very welcome, very much welcome to do with these kind of changes.
Yeah, I think without diving too deep into the whole industry standard thing again, we should probably make another video on it because it's always great content.
Yeah.
But think of it like this way: studios and provider, like the software providers, have spent decades building software together to tweak it so that it fits production. Blender has been outside of that sphere for a very long time and comes in as like the new kid on the block, even though it's been going, I don't know, for 20 years or something like that, maybe more. And so it's hard to become industry standard when you haven't been you haven't been a part of the whole, like the party. You haven't been invited to the party before, and now you have to figure out how to fit in, right? I'm sure it'll get there and it'll become more and more popular. It's already getting more popular, right? With the release of 2.8, that was really when things started to go. It was 2.8, right? I think so. That's when it went crazy. And I wouldn't be as focused on the whole, is it industry standard yet or not? It's like, it's a popular piece of software that does some things really well. Use it for what it does really well.
No, I think that's key. There's so many companies, so many people are too concerned with what big VFX studios are using. I mean, who cares? They if they use Maya or Max or anything, it's not like an acknowledgement or an endorsement of those tools. A lot of those tools are just legacy as well. They might be terrible tools, but they might just be so integrated into a pipeline. One new thing that is new in it, or not even new, it's a refinement. It's one of those things we keep talking about, that there is a lot of like paper cuts or like weird UX issues in Blender. They've revamped a lot of stuff in the main principal BSDF node, which is awesome.
I want to talk about that one. Yeah, that was.
Yeah, I mean, go for it.
Definitely.
You know more about this than I do.
I mean, I think an interesting thing, one that from comments that I've seen, I don't think I see an overwhelming majority of people liking the collapsible part of the shaders, but I, for one, really like it because it declutters my interface and my nodes massively. Because most of the time, you don't need 20 inputs. You just need color, roughness, spec, and then you're maybe metallic and you're good to go. I mean, most of the time, you really only need a couple of inputs. So having the most popular ones be visible from the beginning, I think is nice. It's one of those things. It's a nice upgrade. It doesn't change anything fundamentally. It just makes it a little more nicer to work with. But the upgrades in general to the BSDF shader, like using multi-scatter GGX by default, updates to sheen and coat, and the way that the BSDF shader works in general, I think are going to be great because it just allows you to create better materials faster, and they just work together better especially with AGX now as well. Everything should sort of play nicer together. That's a thing that I really like because I use the shaders quite a lot, and I think they're welcome changes.
Yeah, one thing I'm always looking for in new updates is anything that relates to character art. So that would be like hair updates or skin updates or anything like that. And there is a skin update to the shader here because they revamped some stuff in terms of the SSS for it. It now says like random walk parentheses skin, I think it is. And yeah. I don't think that is such a shader change. I think it's a UX change where before we made a video not too long ago on how to do skin shading in Blender. And honestly, it's a little bit convoluted, at least like pre this version here, where you just have to know how it works. The albedo color, you would just have to plug into the SSS color, and you have to change the radius using like just a color node and such. So that kind of stuff is a little bit convoluted, but if you know how it works, like I know how the skin shading works in like how you make appealing skin shading in general, then I don't think the result is going to look any different. But I think if you don't know how it works, it's going to be a lot easier to set it up now. Like it's kind of akin to my feature request for HDRI lighting. You don't have to follow a tutorial to do this kind of stuff anymore. It's really easy for somebody like us who's been doing this for a long time to take things for granted that, oh, but I know how to set up a skin shader, so why would you want to simplify that?
Right.
And then they actually do the skin shading update, and it's just a lot easier for everyone, including myself as well. You kind of have like a bit of like the expert bias in the sense that you don't realize what it's like to be new to a software. And you just, everyone, of course, has the same understanding as you, and a lot of the weird paper cuts and UX irritation, you kind of just gloss over. Like, that's us with ZBrush as well. There's so many things that it's so deeply baked into our muscle memory that we don't see them as issues. And then you see a beginner trying to use a software and you're like, right, they don't know how to save their project. Same thing here as well. Setting up skin shading sucks. It's difficult. Skin shading is just really difficult. But once you know the setup for it, it's honestly not that hard. So very, very welcome change here as well. But as far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong here, such in the comments for people watching. I think it's like cosmetic in terms of like I think it's a UX thing. I don't think it's a core shader thing, but I could very well be wrong there.
I'm just looking at the docs here now for Random Walk, specifically for skin. And while I don't think there have been updates to really how it does the skin shading, I think there have been updates to how the values sort of play together. So maybe that does define that it's been updated a little bit. Like what it says here is that the radius is automatically adjusted based on the color texture, and the subsurface entry direction uses a mix of diffuse and specular transmission. And obviously there's the IOR input now, which was there before for normal skin, but is now exclusive to the Random Walk skin preset or selection if you want. So I think you might be right that there's nothing fundamentally new. It's just a rearrangement and sort of like they're using more specific inputs with not having those like 3 separate colors for skin. Now they're using the base color instead. In any case, from my tests, I can't say that I've been able to do better skin shading, but I've been able to more easily create nice looking skin with it. It takes less clicks, it takes less fiddling. I don't have to tweak values as much. It's been pretty plug and play for me in my tests.
Pretty interesting with good skin shading, because I'm doing a project now. This is in Maya, and I think the SSS is a little bit nicer there. That's why I do this in Maya. But it's pretty shocking.
Well, that's specifically for Arnold, right?
Specifically for Arnold. It's pretty shocking to see how few nodes I'm actually using. Like I'm using like for the whole skin shader, I think I'm using like, I could simplify this down into like 5 nodes, basically, for the whole thing. Because the skin shading is all about, I mean, this is a crazy tangent here. Not crazy, it's just a tangent where it's just about the color maps, or it's just about the texture maps and the sculpt itself.
Yeah.
So if that stuff is solid, people overcomplicate skin shading all the time. But yeah, very welcome improvement to Blender. Just like UX, anything UX with Blender for me, because I find the UX to be weird in Blender. So anything that like, wouldn't really call it standardizes it, but it's not like it needs to be more like Max or Maya. It just has to be more logical. Essentially, any feature I think you should be able to use as many features as possible without having to watch any tutorials on it. Like you should just kind of make sense how it works. Like again, the ZBrush versus Mudbox. You can open a Mudbox, start sculpting right away. In ZBrush, you actually need tutorials on how to use that bloody software.
I mean, we watch our own tutorials sometimes just to get a refresher on how to do certain things, because ZBrush is just quirky.
It's the weirdest thing whenever that happens. I've had this a few times now where I'm watching one of my own tutorials and I'm like, man, I never knew that. That's a cool tip. And it's me telling myself that. Of course I knew that. It's not like I've forgotten how to do a thing. I've forgotten that I knew how to do the thing. Like it's like that I even knew it in the first place. It's a really weird.
Like we talked about the other day. I needed to do something with origins in Blender, and I hadn't opened up Blender, I don't know, like a couple of months maybe, and I definitely hadn't done any modeling. And like anything that had to do with origins, I just wiped from my memory. First thing I look up, click on a video, it's you making a YouTube video on exactly what I needed. So thanks for that.
The worst I've had is there where I do that and I wonder how to do something, and it's my own tutorial. And the problem is there, I might remember the tutorial. I'm like, crap, that's the only documentation there is on the subject. I had this recently where I can't remember what it was I was learning, but my tutorial was the only thing there, which means that what I currently know might be the best knowledge currently online about the subject. I'm like, crap. Now you get stuck really easily.
I want something better.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why I'm Googling it, right? I already know what I know, so.
Yeah. Another thing, just quickly for the shaders. I mentioned Multiscatter GGX has received improvements, and I think that combined with the new way that they're doing the coat layer, it was previously called clear coat because that's pretty much exclusively what it was for. It's just another coat on top of your shader, essentially. Very common with like car shaders, for example. You have your base paint with flakes and whatever, and then you have that clear lacquer on top that sort of protects and seals the paint. That combination of those two with multiscatter now being the default. The problem with multiscatter before is that it was less efficient. It was more accurate, but it wasn't as fast rendering wise as GGX. There were like some noise disadvantages, if I remember correctly. But now multiscatter is default and it's more physically accurate. Combine that with the new coat as well, you can really create some awesome materials in not a lot of time. And one of the examples that they gave in the release notes for coat is you could create like an iPhone screen, for example, where you have an emissive layer, because you can turn on emission while you're using coat. You have like an emissive layer and then coat, because that's the priority of how it goes. And you basically have like a lit up iPhone screen with reflections intact without having to do any modeling. You don't have to model a glass screen. You don't have to model like the LCD underneath. You can do it all in the shader.
Yeah, that's really cool. A lot of those ones. I keep using the coat for skin shading as well, like as a secondary reflection layer, where you can have
of course, yeah.
Something I learned from my girlfriend actually, who they were using that in her company, where they the way I'm doing it now is I'm using roughness for more of a base layer, so just more like a fairly like soft reflection, and then I'm using coat for like a really harsh, really like sharp reflection. So it might be like just to like enhance the pores in the face, or for like really sharp things around the lips and nose. So that stuff works very well. So yeah, little pro tip there, which I learned fairly recently.
It's actually not a bad thing to do in general, because you actually notice quite a big difference in sort of perceived realism if you combine roughness with the coat layer, the clear coat layer. It just, and like Henning says, where you have that variation in roughness, like they shouldn't have the same roughness, because then it doesn't do anything. But where you have one that's softer and one that's sharper, in general, for most reflections, it might not be as accurate as how, like, I don't know, a marble tabletop would look, but that extra bit of reflection I always think is pretty nice.
Yeah, roughness is one of those things that annoys me a little bit, because roughness is a cheat. Because roughness is really microfacets in the surface. It's not, stuff isn't shiny or more or less shiny based on different places, just like inherently they all receive this, the reflections are still the same around them. So it's kind of a cheat. It's a necessary cheat, because otherwise we have to simulate a crazy amount of things. But if you have, for instance, like a forehead or a nose that might be shiny, and you might have your cheeks that's not shiny, it's because they're just a microfaceting and such, and like stuff around your nose gets really stretched, so there's less like folds and such. It's the same thing if you were to have like a chrome sphere and you were to go over it with sandpaper. It's the same material, but now that it's going to be a lot rougher in certain areas because you've just gone over the perfect chrome sphere with sandpaper. Same material, but you're really just simulating like scratches or microfacets in it. So I don't have a point with what I'm talking about now. It's just kind of an interesting one, that roughness is inherently kind of a cheat. That you are really simulating the underlying structure of the mesh. It's almost like roughness is modeling to some degree. And you can actually kind of not even prove this, but use this in a practical way. I do this for, like, for instance, the character I'm working on now, and the Shrek character, where if you do a roughness first, for instance, you just do your color map, then you do your roughness, then the moment you're adding like a bump map or a displacement norm map on top of that, the roughness changes entirely. So you have to kind of do that first, like all the bump and all the pores and all the microfacets on first, and then you can start to like modulate it with roughness. Most of the time, people can keep the roughness like really simple, like almost it's like gradients, and then you can break it up a little bit here and there. But as long as your bump and such is done, it's like properly done, it's authored in a correct way, you can really get away with like a simple one. Then if you have a simple roughness and a simple like coat, like particularly like upgraded 1 and 2 and 4 here, you just get really nice and very simple shaders as well. The material can be very simple in terms of the actual nodes.
One thing that I did want to just touch on is something that we talked about right before this. Is I couldn't remember the name of the new engine. It's called Hydrastorm.
Wow.
That's the new sort of real-time render engine. As far as I can understand from the docs, because we weren't quite sure, it's meant to be used with USD, like the USD format. So when exporting into USD, I don't like, from reading everything in their docs, there doesn't really seem to be a focus on this. It's not going to replace Eevee or anything. I think that's why Eevee Next is sort of part of 4.1. Hydrastorm is pretty much exclusively focused on the USD format. This wasn't something that we covered in our update video either, just because I didn't really see it as such a big deal. It might be big for studios if they need to do anything, but from what I can understand, it's mostly to do with previews when you're working with USD. But USD also received a lot of improvements, which is nice to see. Any sort of standardized workflow, file formats, anything getting updated in Blender, I think it's going to help it in the long run, especially with studios using it. So maybe this Hydrastorm is also going to be beneficial to studios using that.
I'm curious actually about USD, because USD is kind of a tricky thing to test as a single person, just as an individual, because USD is, if you were just working by yourself, you were never going to need USD. USD is kind of what they're trying to build as a future of pipelines, which is a software agnostic pipeline, so that you could in theory do your animation in one software, your modeling in another, and the materials in another, and everything would just kind of flow together into one format. The problem with that is that you have to convert a lot of things into a generic data, into the USD format, and it's really difficult. The last few versions of Maya, for instance, have focused quite a lot on that, and they're all trying to kind of play together, but I think it's still a bit far away in most software for like smooth and nice workflow. So I'd be curious how far away it actually is in Blender. Like if that's something that's actually production ready now, and I don't just mean like necessarily like a massive studio, but just where if you were to have just like Maya, Houdini, and Blender together, like how smooth that would actually work. Meaning, are they trying to present this as something that's ready now, or just like in the background they're working on this, every version there are new features for it, and then in like 2 years it's a complete package? Generally don't know. I'd be curious to learn more about that. It's hard to find information about these kind of things, because a lot of this kind of stuff is stuff that's done behind closed doors in companies, particularly like this kind of stuff. This is the kind of stuff that really isn't sexy. Like USD, it's like it's essentially a file format and a pipeline, like a way of structuring a pipeline. But it's so useful as well. Like it's one of those things that Maya, for instance, is pretty good at. Don't want to turn this into a Maya cast here, but Maya is pretty good at these kind of file format interoperabilities, which is one of the reasons it also has like dominance in the industry. And it's just important to stay up to date for software with these kind of things. But yeah, don't know currently the state of that in Blender.
No, and I think it's one of those things where, I mean, you're not going to find a lot of exciting YouTube videos about it.
No.
I think that's one thing that people using Blender and the community in general are really good at. There's a lot of exciting videos about a lot of different topics. But obviously no one's going to make exciting videos about USD, and it's not going to matter to the average user, even someone doing freelance and using it for paid work. USD is just one of those things that's going to fly under the radar and getting used in studios that, you know, the development team is going to focus on to make that interoperability better. But I don't think a lot of people are really going to focus on it or even know what it's being used for, to be honest.
No, there's no reason at all to be concerned with that. It's almost like if you're driving a regular car, you don't have to be concerned with like, long haul shipping or long haul trucking, right? Like it's just a different kind of world from you. One is personal, the other one is like enterprise. I'm looking at all the
Just
new
wondering
features
here.
as well. Like there really isn't a lot of stuff happening to sculpting, painting, and texturing. This is kind of interesting one actually, because this is something we've been talking about with the whole like the future of Blender as well. Because some years ago now,
Yeah.
I guess like 4 or 5 years now, when Pablo was seriously improving the sculpting tools, people got super excited because I mean the sculpting tools got a lot better, and people now assume that because they're improving like crazy right now for I don't know a few months or a year or however long that was, that this is going to keep going forever, you know. And that means if you keep going for 3 years, maybe you're actually fairly similar to the level of ZBrush, at least in a fairly workable way, but it stopped. So
Yeah.
the whole I think it's really important to look at development of software to like see where the software actually is at the moment. Don't like believe promises about the software. Not even like anyone's lying or being dishonest. It's really hard to predict where something, particularly something like Blender, is going to go because it's open source. The whole sculpting improvement is basically one developer finds that to be genuinely interesting. So if that person stops working on it, then the whole sculpting improvement is going to stop unless you find somebody else who's as passionate and talented as Pablo is for that. So it's an interesting one with that, right? Because there might be a lot of improvement in one area, it gets to a good point, and then suddenly it just stops entirely. And it's never going to beat the competitor, in this case, ZBrush, if it keeps going in that direction as well. So yeah, just an interesting part when it comes to the development of that. It's also hard for like the Blender Foundation to just allocate money for sculpting improvements, because you need to be kind of a special person to be able to do that kind of stuff. It's not just general modeling tools. You need to, I think, in order to develop good sculpting tools, you need to understand sculpting to some degree, or at least have somebody very close to you who can like properly test stuff right away.
Yeah, I think that was what was so cool about Pablo was he was actually a good sculptor and a good 3D artist as well as knowing programming. I never kept up with it, so I don't know why the development really stopped. Do you know? Maybe they just
Yeah.
ran out of ideas or he was on to other
Yeah,
things. I don't
yeah.
know.
I'm generally not sure. I knew there was a little bit of like drama around that when he left, but I'm generally not sure what that was about.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, pretty sure he's out, unfortunately,
Okay,
because
yeah.
that would have been fantastic. Because the sculpt
Yeah.
tools they feel a little bit like half done at the moment. Like you can definitely do a lot of things, but there's a lot of stuff that's just missing there. Same with like
They feel a little like mud bugsy,
yeah,
you know.
yeah, they
A little soft, not as crisp as ZBrush.
Yeah. Same with texture painting as well. I'm genuinely curious where that's going to go, because the texture painting in Blender is so simple at the moment, to the point that I don't think you have layers. Like it's so basic that I'm wondering why it exists at this point. I mean, I'm sure it's like it can be handy once in a while. Like for instance, in Maya, you can paint very simple texture maps. So it can be handy for like if you need to do, I don't know, weight painting or something like that. Or like if you're working with hair, you can paint some simple maps there. But you wouldn't use the paint tools in Maya for anything like serious. So I'm curious why they exist in Blender. Maybe it's kind of handy to be able to just like paint something in 3D once in a while. But yeah, I'm curious if they're gonna like actually develop those further, or if they're just gonna be basically dormant, because there really isn't like there are no improvements in this version to actual texture painting whatsoever under the like sculpt, paint, and texture. There are 2 improvements to vertex painting and 2 to sculpting, but they're tiny.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the things that I've experienced as well in this community is this um over reliance on wanting to use one piece of software for everything. And while that can be cool because you can, consolidate everything into one package, it's oftentimes not the best way to go about it because there are reasons why we have specialized tools. So take something like texture painting, for example. The amount of improvements that Blender would need to implement in order to match something like, I mean, they would never be able to match something like Mari, just the pure data that Mari is able to handle. Well, it's maybe something like Substance. Substance is so complicated and complex now with what it can do. It would take a massive amount of development to get those same features into Blender. Sure, you might be able to get some of it in there, some of the procedural stuff with layering and everything, and you could make a 20% version. But then what's the advantage of using the 20% version versus like the 100% one? Free versus paid. Sure, you could use it for some projects, but there specialized software just exists for a reason, and it's okay to use that for when the job calls for it.
Yeah, I had a request some like last week, I think, for if we could make a whole like masterclass using Blender for creating a whole industry level. I think this was a Digidouble, like basically a competitor to the human course that CG Cookie has made, and I couldn't in good faith do that. We'd done like the character portrait masterclass we talked about before, where it does use Blender as the main tool, I suppose, as the main 3D software. The retopo UVs, all that kind of stuff is done there. But I don't even main tool because the majority is spent in ZBrush. But I couldn't do the whole thing in Blender. The sculpting I could kind of maybe take it bit close-ish, but it wouldn't be as close. Any kind of poor detailing or anything like that, I absolutely could not do to the level I can do in Painter and ZBrush. And yeah, it's just not there, particularly like texture painting. Like that would really, like for sculpting and retopo and all that kind of stuff, it could kind of do it. But for anything to do with texture painting, I could not in good faith actually create that. So if you're seeing a texturing course from us, that would be a very basic version of how to do something. It would be a very constrained thing where we're using it for strength, but I could not in good faith make something for the full thing because it's just not there, and that's fine. Right? Use Painter for it. Painter is still fairly inexpensive compared to like a full texturing software today.
I think one of the it might seem silly, but I think a nice one is, again, it doesn't add, actually no, that's a lie, it does add some new things, but it's the native implementation of OBJ for import and export.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's no longer an add-on. Now it's a native, so you don't have to enable an add-on. But one of the things that's really cool about it is that they've updated some of the parameters when it comes to grouping. You can import and export based on different kinds of groups in your OBJ, like material and like vertex groups, different kinds of smoothing groups as well, which makes it a lot easier to work with complex models if you're sticking with OBJ. And most of the time, just because I'm lazy, I'm just using OBJ. I should really be using FBX, but sometimes an OBJ is easier.
Yeah.
And being able to very efficiently separate your model into the correct parts, into the correct groups is actually pretty big for me personally.
But also just like what they're writing here, which I haven't done extensive tests on this, but they're saying that there is significantly better in performance because of this change as well, and that's very much welcome. Now, if they could just have the select export selected tag be on by default, that is annoying.
What they should do is, if anything in the scene is selected and you press export OBJ, have that box be selected. Yeah. I feel like that would make sense. Or either that, or it should be selection by default. And then you could have a checkbox to say export entire scene. Because I have never, ever needed to export everything from my scene ever. It's always like certain parts, and like if I needed it, cool, I could just select everything and export it. But that thing has cost me hours of like things crash or that it's just stuck for a while because it's trying to export everything. That is a frustrating thing that's not default.
Yeah, there are some weird ones like that. I mean, in Maya they solved it in maybe not the most elegant one, but it's like export selection. It's a separate thing. So
yeah,
but it might not be the best either. I'm just annoyed at that one every single time. When working on a project, the first export is always wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I've done it so many times now. I pretty consistently remember, but it's like I've been abused into having to remember this. It's just not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah. We covered really most of the features now, I think. Is there anything else in terms of features we should talk about?
I know that a couple of people talked about just core im- core improvements in Blender. It's not something that I've really looked into. So, but I've heard that, some performance changes here and there
Hmm.
to Blender as a whole. I don't know what they are, but I'm sure that's great. One thing that we talked about before starting this was metal support for Mac OS.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really have a lot to say on the matter. It's more like they're going away from OpenGL and now they're fully supporting Metal, which is great. So, I want to test that out on my Mac as well, just to see what performance is like. It's not gonna match what I have on my desktop, but being able to do things natively in Mac OS with good performance is definitely something that I think is a good change to have.
One video I want to make in the future is how do you work with with Blender on a MacBook, because that is a pain in the ass. Like it's
Oh,
just from like
yeah.
like you obviously need a mouse or something. A trackpad isn't just great, but just how do you actually customize it? I kind of have a setup
Yeah.
for it, but that you just need a tutorial. But I guess we could kind of then talk about like what do you want? Like what kind of feature requests do you have in this? Like if you were like absolute
Hmm.
ruler of the Blender Foundation and you had unlimited money.
I mean, they kind of gave me my biggest request, which was light linking, So I've been on that since the day I opened Blender. Um, that's a very good question. I think um, I've seen it's a bit conflicting with this, but performance in complex scenes, I think Blender still struggles with. Not having one object being subdivided to like 5 million, but having a lot of objects in the scene.
Mm.
I find the performance isn't as great as I would hope for. So maybe an overall performance boost with complex, heavy, and a lot of models. If that was something that could be worked on, I think that would be great.
Yeah, yeah.
What about you?
I would hire a UX designer, and instead
Mm,
of fixing
that's a good
UX
one.
kind of one bug fix at a time and like kind of unifying things here and there, just zoom out, have somebody who might not even be a 3D artist look at this, maybe not be that familiar with the software, and just being like, okay, how do
Yeah,
we
yeah.
make this logical to the point that you can operate the software without crazy tutorials. 2.8 was a massive one there. Like they actually broke a lot of things. I mean, to the point that unless you're really familiar with Blender, you can't really watch any tutorials from before like summer of 2019. Anything 2.8 and earlier, you actually can't watch it because the UX is so different. So they've done it before, but
Yeah.
that still felt like a bit of a. It was a massive improvement, but it still feels quite far away from just a logical software. So I would definitely do
Yeah.
that, uh, and then to spend a lot of time on like smaller things, like legit. Probably my number one request is I want to be able to put objects in the outliner in an arbitrary order. You can't do that.
Oh,
That is
yeah.
actually
Sorting there.
insane. You
Yeah,
can't sort your
that's true.
items in the same way. You can sort collections, so you can move collections up and down. But if you want like 10 models to be in the just an arbitrary order, basically just want them to be in the order you want them to be, can't do that today. You have to put them into collections, and then you have to move the collections around, or you have to like give them alphabetical names, which
Yes.
is actually insane. When I learned that, when I moved to Blender, I actually couldn't believe that, and still hasn't been fixed. They've done some UX improvements here and there to the outliner, but that one is such, it's such a weird
I'm
one.
wondering if you were to do that, if you would have to, because it's fundamentally different from how something like Maya has the outliner, right? That is, your files are there, you can move them however you want, structure them, group them. If you would need to introduce like a different view, like an actual outliner view, because it conflicts, I think, with the way that the outliner, or whatever it's called in Blender, is structured. I don't even know if it's possible in there.
But why can you do it with collections?
Right, you can move collection, but like it's just visual, right? Everything is still like if you go into your Blender file, everything lives there.
Yeah.
But with the collections, it's like you can move collections, but it's visual. It's not they haven't actually been moved. They're still there.
Yeah.
They're just visually moved.
Yeah.
Whereas in Maya, you group things, so they're sort of like
Yeah.
they are in a hierarchy now.
I just want to be
I
able
don't
to
know.
move things up and down. Like we had this before where we had to
Yeah.
do, if I'm doing a tutorial, for instance, a bit of a specific case, but this is something you do all the time. But like in general, right, moving things up and down. But stuff goes into a, like you want to show feature A and you have the first model and it has a bridge tool. Feature 2 has the extrude tool. And you just kind of want to move them up and down based on the order of things. Now we have to add 0, 1, 0, 2 in front of it.
Yeah.
That is just very annoying. So that would be kind of my thing. But also UV tools. Like the UV tools are so underdeveloped in Blender at the moment to the point that it's very frustrating to work with that.
Yeah, I don't use them ever anymore.
Like it's not a series of bugs you have to fix or just improve the UX slightly here and there. Like for me, it's actually kind of an overhaul to the kind of what happened with Maya, like when they introduced the modeling toolkit tools there, where it just improved
Yeah.
so much in a very short amount of time. So for me, it's not just just change this feature over here and there. It's one of those, if you're working with like more for conventional software for UV mapping, it's probably going to be fairly standard with how you UV map. You probably going to click on the model, select some seams, maybe just hit unfold, and you just have the unfold just done. But in Blender, you have to wrestle with like sync selections and such. And what if you want to see the UVs at the same time as you want to see the, like you actually want to see all the UVs? Well, now you have to select them all in the viewport. Oh, but you can use sync selection. Yeah, but that has tons of issues as well with that.
Yeah.
Like I don't understand why. Like this is a solved issue. Like there is no. Like, Blender is where ZBrush is for sculpting in terms of UX weirdness, in terms of UVs. Like it's just something that doesn't have to be particularly complicated, or there isn't a benefit to its weirdness. It really just feels like it's legacy weirdness, and that's
Maybe
very
it's the same thing as with sculpting, where you would need someone that's passionate enough and knowledgeable enough about UVs in order to do a better implementation.
Yeah, and then that developer would maybe instead make something like Rism instead, or
Yeah,
like in the case
exactly.
with like Pablo, like he made like the iPad app, like Cozy Blanket for Retopo. Like they might just instead do something like that. That is more of a commercial thing, which I of course understand. You're spending all your spare time working on open source versus working on something like with Nomad, right? Like the sculpting app for iPad, which is a commercial thing.
Yeah.
I get you that might be a lot more appealing than open source.
One thing that was updated though that I remember is you can now export your UVs, like an image of your UVs in a UDIM format. There we go.
Nice
Update. There you
Yeah,
go.
that's really useful if you were in 2005, I think.
I remember seeing that update. And yeah, there you go.
I haven't needed to
That's-
export out an image of my UV, like a snapshot of my UVs, in a very long time. That's one of the things that
It's been a
UVs,
while.
it became a lot less important to some degree after painting became like 3D painting came around. Of course, you still have to
Yeah.
optimize it. If you're a game artist, like if a game artist watching this, they're gonna be like screaming like crazy now because obviously performance there is important. But before you had to spend so much time on your UVs, but now you just paint on a model. Like seams, you don't really have to think too much about where your seams are placed. I mean, particularly when for film characters, I would have seams all over the face because you kind of had to have so many UDIMs. Maybe the whole face was like 10 UDIMs. You can't hide seams. You're gonna have a seam like cutting the eye in half. Right? You just need to have seams there, but that's not an issue because you don't actually see the seams. So yeah, that's definitely less of an issue today. But you're still in good UV tools. You just need that. For the character portrait masterclass, I did like the initial seam selection in Blender, and then I exported it to ZBrush and did the UV master unfolding there, just because that is the unfolding is just I just think is much stronger in terms of like in a fairly objective manner. I think it's just the unfolding is just better. But
that's my general workflow as well. I mean, get my seams cut, marked, whatever you want to call it, in a 3D software, and then get it into ZBrush and unwrap it there because it just does really, really well. Actually, that reminds me, didn't we look at something at some point with UV Master, wasn't that coming to Maya or something? Am I misremembering?
I have no idea. It
Yeah,
might be
no, it's
Seer Mesher coming to Maya. Because
ah
that
right. Yeah, okay.
the algorithm for Seer Mesher isn't made by Pixelogic, it's made by, I
Right.
think it's a French person or company, or that might not be true.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then it's like licensed for, I don't know licensing terms, but that definitely exists for Maya. I'm pretty sure it exists in Blender as well. Don't quote me on that. But as a
Oh,
third
cool.
party plugin. But I mean the
Yeah.
case in Maya, because they acquired a really good UV tool for that, and
Yeah.
I'm pretty certain the developer of that tool is the guy who went on to make Rism. And that's why Rism is so good, because they took the best tool they had. The Maya UV tools are fantastic. They're really, really good. And then they improved upon them and made it a standalone software. Like that's
Clever.
clever. That's a good one. So if I
Yeah.
was UV mapping like seriously today, if I was doing that a lot, I would just be using Rism. Like if I was, I think my perfect modeling software solution today would be like if I wasn't using Maya. I mean, I just use Maya for kind of legacy reasons, to be honest. It's not like that's the best tool. If I didn't have Maya, I would probably be using Blender for modeling, and then Topogon, like new version of Topogon for topology, and then Rism for UVs. And then you have a very affordable suite. Like Topogon is like $125 or something. Rism isn't crazy expensive compared to at least the time you would save on that. And then you have like a
Yeah.
legit solution for that for modeling, and then you have of course ZBrush for sculpting. Like there wouldn't really be anything that would be like stronger than that. I think. I mean, Blender is particularly strong in modeling as well. That's one of the reasons a lot of people are switching to Blender as well. I think it's not just because it's free; it's because it's actually a legit good modeling tool, very much rivaling its competitors there. So that's awesome to see.
And I would say Lookdev as well.
Yeah.
With all the improvements, being able to live preview things with cycles is a game changer for me. I do everything with cycles and GPU rendering in the viewport, everything, because it's just too good.
I find it to be so intuitive to look at in cycles. I still find compared to Arnold, that Arnold has more advanced features, but for a person as an individual,
Yes,
most of those features you don't really need. If you were to look at the list of all the AI nodes you would have in Arnold, it's insane and it's so specialized, and I'm sure it's all made in the fires of VFX and that kind of stuff, but it's also very clunky to work with. If you being able to do like even looked at it in Eevee as well, that's what I'm doing for actually Intro to Mari course I'm working on, where you can just import your maps and you can just see it really well in Eevee. Of course, it's going to look better in Cycles. Not that much better though, but you can just preview it. You can kind of just get see what the general spec response is. You can just see if the UDIMs are working correctly. You can see if the general texture, tone, and color space stuff is working, and that's fully real time. Like just being able to have Eevee for looked at is actually a game changer in that regard. It speeds it up so much, because the majority of the time I'm doing look diving, I'm not really just doing like changing an attribute and a rendering, or like doing the really really fine stuff. A lot of it is just trying to, is the material working or not? Like debugging things, and that is so much faster in Cycles and in Eevee, particularly with GPU rendering.
100%. I don't really think I have more to add to this massive Blender update. Do you? Is there anything specific you want to talk about?
Pretty sure that we are at the end of that. I mean, it's a cool update. Really, really cool stuff. Very exciting to see where the node tools are being taken. That is kind of an unknown, because that's not just by itself. That feature doesn't really do much. It's what the community does with it. So that remains to be seen. But the people in the Blender community are absolutely crazy when it comes to this stuff. I'm pretty certain you can bet a lot of money that in 6 months there's going to be a lot of awesome stuff coming from that as well. And personally, I'm excited about the light linking, because I mean we've been kind of waiting with getting the lighting scenes, the Flipgnomes lighting scenes out, because we really needed light linking for that to work.
Yes.
So I can't wait to get that out as well for people. Cool release, new tech to play with. Very excited.
All right, that I think that about wraps it up, and I have nothing more to add either. So we will see you in the next podcast or video,
Yeah.
which I'm not sure when we do another one. Maybe next week? Probably.
Probably. Cool. See you guys soon.